Thanks very much. It's a real pleasure to come and tell you a few thoughts on this topic of drugs addiction and the brain. It's something that I've investigated for quite a few years now. You're going to get a very idiosyncratic view and kind of a bird's eye view of how people, particularly in behavioral neuroscience, think about this topic of addiction and how we become addicted. So I also should mention that all of the sort of the conceptual stuff that I'm going to talk to you about was done in collaboration with my colleague Kent Berridge, who also is in psychology here at the University of Michigan. So, the first thing I want to tell you is what addiction is not. And addiction's not taking drugs. That is, people take drugs for a whole lot of different reasons. They're experimenting, it makes them feel good, you know, they're relieving some unpleasant state, perhaps stress. They want to stay awake on a long drive, that's circumstantial use. They want to be cool because their friends are doing it. People take drugs for a lot of different reasons. But drug-taking behavior is not addiction. They're really quite different things. And addiction is referring to a very specific pattern of drug-taking behavior. And you can go and look at various sources to try to find a definition of addiction, and you'll get many different definitions of addiction. And I'm just going to show you a couple of them. Because what we're trying to explain is not why people take drugs. We're trying to explain why people become addicts. And so addiction this is a bulletin of the World Health Organization, who's defining addiction as a particular pattern of drug-taking behavior that's manifest at the expense of many other activities, and at its extreme it becomes compulsive. And you'll often see this word compulsive come up. People also usually include in that it's a chronic relapsing disorder. That is, addicts, stop taking drugs lots of the time. The problem is that they tend to start taking them again, even when they're trying to be abstinent. This is just another kind of a definition from the American Society of Addiction Medicine, where they have this sort of A, B, C, D, E idea. But again, the concepts here is the pattern, that is this compulsive use, this inability to stop taking even though you express a desire to stop taking. This compulsive pattern of use. So what you're trying to explain is not why people take drugs, but why some people develop and undergo this transition from mere drug-taking behavior to compulsive patterns of drug-taking behavior that take over their lives and that they have a great difficulty quitting. So that's what you're trying to explain, not just why people take drugs. Now, again, historically in our society at least, there's sort of two very, very different views of addiction. One of them is addicts are just bad people doing bad things, and it's a moral failure kind of thing, which is certainly still out there a lot, particularly in this country. There's also a medical model, and this is highlighted by this paper that was published in Science a number of years ago by Al Eschner when he was director of the National Institutes of Drug Abuse, and he's making the case here that addiction is a brain disease, which is basically the view I'm going to take here. And it doesn't explain why people take drugs in the first place. You could say if people never took drugs in the first place, they'd never become addicts. That's true. And so people make some bad decisions sometimes to use drugs. But the vast majority who use drugs, even drugs like cocaine, the vast majority never go on to have problems with drugs. It's a relatively small minority of people who try potentially addictive drugs that go on to have addiction. And so the question in the field, the hard question in the field is, why is it that some people and only a small proportion of people go on to have problems with drugs? Because that's the problem of addiction. And that's where this idea comes, is that after sampling drugs for whatever reason, the brain changes. And it changes in some people a lot more than in other people, and this is probably very important in the development of addiction. So, why does it matter how we think about addiction? Well, it actually matters a lot because it has a lot of implications in terms of social and health policy. And just to give you one example of this is just look at the rate of people incarcerated in the United States. And this is an American phenomenon. This doesn't happen anyplace else in the world. So this is the rate of incarcerated Americans over time with the war on drugs starting back in 1971. The startling statistic is today around half of all federal prisoners are in prison for drug crimes, and most of these are minor drug offenses. And so that's a lot of people in prison for drug offenses. And the reason that they're in present of drug offenses is they're being punished because it's a bad, bad thing to use drugs. As I said, this is really very much an American phenomenon. You don't see these kinds of rates of incarcerations anyplace else in the world. The United States is a real outlier, and this big difference between the United States and most other countries in the world really has to do with the incarceration rate. It's not totally due to, but a big factor is how many people are put into jail for relatively minor drug offenses. It doesn't work doing that, of course. We've known that for a long time. Here's the number of people over time in prison, and here's the price of heroin and cocaine over the same period of time. The drugs get cheaper and more available the more people you put in prison. That's a correlation, of course, not causation, but it's clearly not working very well. So going back so how do we think about this transition to this compulsive pattern of drug-seeking and drug-taking behavior? So why do some people develop this destructive pattern of drug self-administration behavior? And in psychology, historically, there's two broad categories of explanation. And what I'm going to tell you next in the next few slides is that neither of these are correct. But they're the major sort of categories historically of explanation. And in them, they view drugs as either positive reinforcers or negative reinforcers. So in the language of learning in psychology, a positive reinforcer is simply a stimulus or event that increases the probability that you'll repeat the act that produced it. So in a rat, you press a bar, it gives you a drug, that increases the probability that you press the bar again. That's positive reinforcement. Negative reinforcement is simply you increase the frequency of the action because your action alleviates an unpleasant state. Okay? And that's a negative reinforcer. And drugs can act both as positive reinforcers and negative reinforcers as they're defined here. I'm going to deal with negative reinforcement very quickly, but this quote that I like, which is from George Koob's lab. George Koob is now the director of NIAAA, which is the Alcohol Institute at NIH, is basically saying drug craving, that is the motivation to take drugs, is due to one of two factors, and this is the traditional kind of idea. It's either the desire to experience the hedonic effects of the drugs. Why do people take drugs? Makes them feel good. It's not really more complicated than that. Or sometimes they're motivated to take drugs to avoid aversive withdrawal syndromes. That's a negative reinforcement kind of idea. That is, you've taken drugs, you stop taking drugs, that makes you feel really crappy, and so you take drugs again so you don't feel crappy. That's basically a withdrawal avoidance kind of idea, and it's a negative reinforcement model because you're taking drugs to alleviate an aversive state. These negative reinforcement models really were in the vogue back in the 30s, 40s, and 50s when there really wasn't much cocaine or amphetamine use at the time. It was mainly heroin. And when you stop taking drugs like opiates, like heroin, you do have a marked withdrawal syndrome where you feel pretty crappy. You have diarrhea, the chills. It's like a really bad flu. If you watch movies, they'll make it seem like that's it, you're going to die or something. It's actually not that bad. Addicts tend to overemphasize their withdrawal problems. Withdrawal from alcohol, by the way, is serious. You can die from that. No one dies from withdrawal from opiates. They just complain a lot about it. But since the early studies focused on opiates, and you could see this obvious withdrawal syndrome when physical dependence developed, people talked primarily about drugs as negative reinforcers, and they thought what motivated people, addicts, to take drugs again and again was to avoid having to undergo this withdrawal syndrome. We've known for a long time, and that's true, that sometimes addicts are motivated to take drugs to avoid withdrawal symptoms. But we've known for a long time, and I'm not going to give you all the reasons why. I'm just going to make the argument by reference to authority here. We've known for a long time that physical dependence and withdrawal are neither necessary nor sufficient conditions to account for addiction. I mean, almost everybody agrees with that now. It doesn't mean that sometimes in some individuals, people don't take drugs to avoid withdrawal. They do, but it's not a necessary or sufficient condition to account for this compulsive pattern of drug-seeking and drug-taking behavior that takes place at the expense of most other activities in life. And that's what these quotes are just basically telling you. So I just dispensed with negative reinforcement theories. I mean, you could go on for the next 5 hours talking about that, but I'm just going to dispense with it. It was when people started taking drugs like amphetamine or cocaine, which came a little bit later in the 60s and 70s, and cocaine really not till the 80s, that people started to really focus on the drugs not as negative reinforcers, but as positive reinforcers. Because you don't get a real physical withdrawal syndrome when when an addict stops taking amphetamine or cocaine. It's not like opiates. I mean, people report that they become a little dysphoric, they're not happy that they're not taking the drug, but you don't see these physical signs of withdrawal like you do in a heroin addict. And so people started to focus on the action of drugs as positive reinforcers. So again, just remember, a positive reinforcer is simply a stimulus or event that increases the probability of the preceding behavior. And so you take a drug, and if you take a drug and that increases the probability you'll perform the action to take the drug again, then by definition the drug's acting as a positive reinforcer. It's reinforcing that kind of behavior. And that's basically the definition of a positive reinforcer. And so the idea here is drugs promote drug-taking behavior because of their action of positive reinforcers. And so, students coming out of Psych 101, well, yeah, they'll learn about positive reinforcers, and somebody say, well, why do addicts take drugs? Well, because drugs are positive reinforcers. It sounds like you actually know something and you're saying something. You are, in fact, saying absolutely nothing. And the reason for that is that it's logically equivalent to saying the reason people take drugs is because drugs increase the probability of drug taking, which is, of course, a completely circular argument. That is, the causal relationship is in the definition of positive reinforcement. And again, people have pointed this out over the years, although the concept is hard to get rid of. And this is a quote I love. Peter Dews has all kinds of great quotes from back in the 70s. He points out many things can reinforce and many things can be maintained by reinforcement, which is fine, of course, provided that we do not come to suppose that in demonstrating an event as a reinforcer, we have demonstrated something more than that the event is a reinforcer. And B.F. Skinner, of course, who's the father of behaviorism and was famous for studying schedules of reinforcement, makes the same point. He says it's okay to, the only defining characteristic of a reinforcing stimulus is that it reinforces. And he says, well, that's not circular. You can classify events in terms of their effects. But it would be circular if you went on to assert that a given event strengthens an operant, which means an action, because it's a reinforcer. You can't say the because there is no because in the concept of positive reinforcement, which means to pursue this idea of sort of positive reinforcement effects, that drugs act as positive reinforcers, you have to come up with some drug effect that causes the person or the animal to repeat the behavior. And that's why people like Roy Wise have argued over the year the only existing positive reinforcement view of addiction that can qualify as an explanatory theory, that is, can account for the because, identifies positive reinforcement with drug euphoria. And so this is the view of addiction that if you go out in the street and ask, 50 people randomly, why do addicts or why do people take drugs, they'll say, most of the time, because it makes you feel good. It produces pleasure. It's euphorogenic, right? This is a very common sense, popular view of addiction. Addicts take drugs because it produces pleasure. And so this is basically, this positive reinforcement type model of addiction is basically a pleasure-seeking view. You have to, by this view, that drugs have to be so pleasurable that people will take them despite the fact that they lost their wife, their job, they're laying in the gutter covered with fleas, all of the problems that come with addiction, but it's just so good. We know that that's not true. And all you have to do is think about tobacco. Yes, it's true lots of addictive drugs are powerfully euphorogenic, amphetamine, cocaine, heroin, and so on. But there's very addictive drugs that aren't. No one describes taking a puff of a cigarette saying, oh my God, that's better than the best orgasm I ever had. They just don't use those kinds of terms. Nicotine cigarettes are not euphorogenic, but they're very addictive. There's no good relationship between how euphorogenic drugs are and how addictive they are. And I'm going to show you an example of an experimental study that demonstrates this in a very unique way. But first, another Peter Dews quote. Again, this idea that euphorogenic power of drugs doesn't explain addiction has been known for a long time. But as Dews points out, It was supposed that the prediction of addiction liability was essentially equivalent to the prediction of euphorogenic power. As with most self-evident ideas, the mere matter of there being essentially no evidence in favor of it and much against it has had little effect on its acceptance. And that's pretty much true today. I mean, people actually think, of course, that the motivating driving force behind addictive patterns of drug-seeking and drug-taking behavior is for the pleasure. So here's an example of a study that shows how there's no necessary causal relationship between the ability of drugs to produce pleasure and their ability to promote taking drugs. So this is an interesting study that was published a number of years. This happens to be with an opiate, morphine, so these are heroin addicts. Similar kinds of things have been done with other drugs like cocaine. So what we have here are 5 people, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, so 5 people, and then this is just the average. And they come into the lab, and they can work. They literally have to press a lever, like you would have a rat do, and they press the lever for either placebo, that is no drug, or one of 4 different doses of morphine. Okay, addicts aren't stupid. They'll work to get the drug, all 4 doses, but they won't work to get nothing, to get saline, right? So all this is showing, no surprise, that morphine acts as a positive reinforcer. People will work to get it, but they won't work to get placebo, so clearly it's reinforcing this drug-taking behavior. But why? Why are they taking drugs? Of course, a pleasure-seeking explanation of drug-taking has to say that, well, the reason they're taking it is that when they get the morphine here, they feel good. Well, it turns out that that's not true. It's true when you go to the higher doses, it's good. But what we have here are subjective ratings at placebo and the low dose of morphine. And what they're doing is asking how much did you like it, how good was it, how much would you pay for it. They're asking all those kinds of questions. And the thing to note, there goes my water again, is that the ratings for placebo are exactly the same as the ratings for the low dose of morphine. But they work for the one, and they don't work for the other. That is, they work for a dose of the drug that produces no subjective effects. In fact, the people who are working for it will say there's no drug. They'll insist there's no drug there, but they're pressing the lever for the drug that's not there. And so when you go to higher doses, of course, the higher doses start to produce these euphorogenic, good feeling effects, which makes you think that they must be doing it for that. But it's a correlation. Yes, at high doses, you get both positive reinforcing seeking effects, and you get pleasure, but does the pleasure cause the seeking, that is the motivation to work for it? And as this study shows, and again, there are a number of studies like this, that the reinforcing effects, the willingness to work for the drug, can occur in the absence of any self-reported subjective effects, and therefore don't appear to be causally related to drug liking or drug euphoria. That is, there's not a necessary causal relationship between the ability of drugs to produce pleasure and the willingness of people to work for them. You can pull those apart. Most of the time, they look like they go together. But with these kinds of tricks, like looking at very low doses, you can see that it's not a necessary causal relationship because you can pull them apart. So what I've been arguing here is that addictive patterns of drug-seeking and drug-taking behavior are not attributable either to withdrawal avoidance or to pleasure-seeking. That is, neither of those kinds of conditions are necessary and sufficient causes of what we call addiction. So what are the alternatives? Well, one way to start looking for alternatives is to ask on what brain systems do drugs work to produce their rewarding effects. And that takes us to talk a little bit about the neurotransmitter dopamine. Dopamine figures large in work on the neurobiology of addiction. So just a little background for those of you who aren't neuroscientists. Most of you know, I think drugs are cells in the nervous system. The cells that communicate information are called neurons. And the dopamine neurons refer to neurons that have a cell body, and most neurons have a cell body located in one place in the brain, And that's where all the genetic machinery is that makes all the proteins and stuff. But then it sends an axon, a projection, to some other cell, and neurons communicate that when the cell becomes active, it releases a neurotransmitter onto the next cell, which acts on receptors, and that results in communication between cells. And so when this dopamine cell here fires and releases dopamine, you change the activity of the subsequent cells, and you can change them in very, very diverse ways. Everywhere from just changing their excitability to changing gene expression for the rest of your life. You can have very profound effects by altering neurotransmission this way. So the dopamine neurons that are thought to be very important in terms of drug effects are dopamine neurons who have cell bodies in a region of the brain called the ventral tegmental area, the VTA, and they project to a region up higher in the brain called the nucleus accumbens. And so we'll talk about this circuit a little bit. Why are people who study drugs so interested in dopamine? Well, there's a number of reasons, but one of the reasons is that all these various drugs of abuse actually have very different primary actions. They act on different receptors in different brain regions, on different cells. They're very, very different. And one thing people in the field have looked for many years is, well, what do they have in common? These are all different potentially addictive drugs. We know they're all very different. And one thing they have in common that was discovered quite a few years ago is that they release dopamine. And so this is a study done a number of years ago by Nini Di Chiara. And he's just basically showing when the line goes up like this, dopamine's being released. It's a way to measure dopamine release in animals. And it's just showing that drugs like amphetamine, cocaine, morphine, alcohol, nicotine, all cause dopamine to go up. And so that observation provided the first foundation that one thing that drugs of abuse have in common is this ability to increase dopamine. The other kind of finding that came out very early on was that if you prevent drugs from releasing dopamine by blocking or dopamine having an effect by blocking dopamine receptors, that interferes with the willingness of both people and animal to work for drugs. That is, it decreases the self-administration of drugs. And so those two kinds of observations led to a real focus on dopamine as sort of a common currency that must be involved in mediating some of the effects, the rewarding effects of drugs. Okay, so I'm going to change a little bit now. So here I'm showing, you give an acute, the first time you give an injection of any of these drugs, you'll see this big surge in dopamine, particularly in the nucleus accumbens. But of course, addicts aren't taking drugs once. They're taking drugs again and again and again and again and again for months or years and years and years. And so we have to also think about how do the effects of drugs change when you're repeatedly exposed to drugs, which is the case in addiction, of course. Well, first principle is the effects of drugs aren't constant. They change as a consequence of experience with drugs. Now, the kind of change that takes place in terms of drug effects that most people are familiar with is tolerance. And that's because it's a real problem in medicine. Many drugs that are used to treat all kinds of medical conditions, you develop tolerance to it, which just means that you need higher and higher doses over time to get the same effect. And that's the definition of tolerance. That is, you need higher and higher doses to maintain a given effect. And many effects of drugs of abuse, as well as many other drugs used in medicine, show this tolerance. And so you have to keep upping your dose to get the same effect. However, another kind of change that occurs with drugs that people know much less about, and it isn't well known in the public, is a phenomenon known as sensitization. And you can think of sensitization as sort of the opposite of tolerance. That is, a given drug effect with repeated drug administration gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. You get more bang for your buck if you've had drug in the past than if you haven't, rather than with tolerance, where you get less effect than if you've had the drug in the past. And so I'm going to focus on sensitization here. And that's because this brain system that I talked about, so this is just a schematic now of this ventral tegmental area to nucleus accumbens dopamine projection. So in red is a system that is the dopamine system and that releases dopamine. And so you can ask, what happens to that dopamine system, which we know is very important in terms of mediating many drug reward kinds of effects? What happens to it with repeated exposure to drugs? And one way to assay what's happening to that system behaviorally is to look at a phenomenon called psychomotor stimulation. And what that is, all that means is you run around a lot. That is, when you give, it's what you think of is when you think of someone on amphetamine or cocaine, they can't stop moving, they're moving around, they can't shut up, they're talking continually, they become very hyperactive. And that phenomenon is referred to as psychomotor stimulation. You see that in animals given these drugs. And a number of the experiments I'm going to show you were animal experiments. And so one thing we know about the psychomotor activating effects of drugs is that those effects are mediated by this system. When dopamine is released, animals get wired. They become very hyperactive, and you can measure that. And so here's a typical sensitization experiment. This is with amphetamine. And you give amphetamine the first time, the control group is getting saline, and you have a measure of this psychomotor activation. And I won't go into the details of how you measure that, but it's a measure of this sort of how wired you get on the drug. And you can see relative to saline, the first time you get the drug, they become hyperactive. But then you give them the drug again, a second time, and this is 2 to 3 days later, and a third time, a fourth time, a fifth time, and they get 10 injections of the drug. And what you can see is you're getting greater and greater psychomotor activation as a consequence of repeated exposure to the drug. That's sensitization, and it's specifically psychomotor sensitization. It's sensitization to the psychomotor activating effects of the drugs, which, as I said, is thought to reflect what's going on in dopamine systems. This sensitization phenomenon has a couple very interesting features. One of them is that once you have become sensitized to these drugs, you stay sensitized for a really long time. Now, these are in rats, so rats can live up to about 3 years. This is an experiment where animals were given amphetamine in the past and then left off amphetamine, just chilled out for a year. That's a really, really long time in a rat's life. I say it's a really long time in a rat's life. It's also a really long time in a graduate student's life, and I've never got a graduate student who will wait longer than a year to get the results. So a year is all as long as we've gone. But what you can see is that even a year after the last time these animals were exposed to amphetamine, you give them another injection, and they're markedly hypersensitive. You get this marked sensitization kind of effect. And what that's telling you is that whatever change in the brain that the drug produced lasts a long time. And so people will talk about sensitization potentially lasting for the rest of your life. It's based on studies like this. We don't know about the rest of your life, but we know a long time. The other interesting feature of this is pretty much every drug of abuse does it. That is, it's not something you just see with amphetamine or cocaine, but you get it with drugs that have primarily CNS depressant properties as well, like morphine or alcohol, ethanol. Many, many different drugs of abuse, when you give them repeatedly, and you measure their psychomotor activating effects, and they all have psychomotor activating effects, which isn't surprising because they all release dopamine, and the release of dopamine produces psychomotor activation. And so all of these various drugs of abuse produce this psychomotor sensitization kind of phenomena, and it's very, very long lasting. Okay, so I said when this system, this dopamine system is activated, it causes psychomotor activation, but the other thing that it does, we know that it's very important in mediating drug reward. If you take out this system, animals won't work for drugs anymore, okay? And so it's thought that this system is not only important for psychomotor activation, but it's important for the process of drug reward, as well as the rewarding effects of what are called natural rewards, food, water, sex, and so on. But if this system is changing, becoming sensitized, which the phenomenon of psychomotor sensitization suggests, then you would expect that if you did other measures, like measures about how rewarding the drugs are, those would also sensitize. That is, they get bigger with drug experience. And indeed, that's exactly what happens. There's a bunch of studies showing this kind of thing. And the kinds of things that people have done here is to give animals drugs at some point in their life, and then later on ask how quickly they acquire self-administration, that is, learn to work, bar press, to get drug. And if you've had drug in the past, you're sensitized to this rewarding effect of the drug. You acquire self-administration much more quickly. You'll go back to places where you got drug much more readily. And what this last one is referring to is sort of how hard you'll work for it. It's a particular schedule that measures sort of how motivated or hard you'll work for drug. and that animals that have been sensitized in the past will work, in the future, will work much harder for the drug. So this is sort of what you can call sensitization of the rewarding effects of drugs. So you not only get sensitization of the psychomotor activating effects, but you see sensitization of the rewarding effects. And why might that be? Well, the reason, of course, is both of these effects are thought to be mediated by this VTA dopamine system. It's a common system mediating these sorts of effects. And so if it's changing, then all of the sort of behaviors that are mediated by that system should also change. And indeed, that's what it looks like. But you also, of course, can go in and ask directly, does the dopamine system change as a consequence of becoming sensitized to drugs? And it does. I mean, again, there's literally thousands of papers on this topic now. I'm just giving you a couple of examples. And this was an early one. This is just showing animals that in the past have been given amphetamine are given later on, in this case it's after a month after their last injection, are given amphetamine again, and compared to controls getting it the first time, you get amphetamine the first time, you get an effect like this. But if a month earlier you had been exposed to amphetamine, you get this kind of an increase in dopamine. This is dopamine release. No wonder they're running around more, because the injection of drug is causing much more massive dopamine release if you've had drugs in the past and have become sensitized to them than if you haven't. This kind of sensitization of dopamine release, if you will, has been described with amphetamine, cocaine, alcohol, morphine, ecstasy, MDMA, nicotine, many, many different drugs, again, that produce psychomotor sensitization, show these kinds of changes in dopamine systems. And you see the same thing in humans. So this is an experiment that's looking at sensitization now, but in college students, who readily will volunteer for such experiments, believe it or not. And what they're doing here, this is a group in McGill, in Canada, in Montreal. And what they're doing is they're bringing people in the lab, they're putting them into a PET scanner, and they're looking how much dopamine release you get the first time they're exposed to amphetamine, the fourth time, and the fifth time what they did was they waited a year. They brought them back a year later into the scanner and measured dopamine release to the drug again. And these are just different brain regions, so we'll just look at the story's the same for all of them. Here's the control. Now, in this case, because of the method, down is more. So you go the reverse. So here's how much dopamine release you got the first time. Here's how much you got the fourth time. And these are pretty small doses because you can't give too big a doses in college students. And you can see you're getting more release. Down is more release. The remarkable thing is you now wait a year and bring them back and give them one more injection, and they're getting even bigger release than they did after the fourth one. That's a phenomenon you see in animals all the time. That is, if you go off drug for a while and you come back, you'll get even bigger sensitization effects. And that's what you're seeing in humans. Okay? This is another example of this sort of sensitized dopamine release in humans. But it's a particularly interesting one when thinking about addiction, because this is a phenomenon called dopamine dysregulation syndrome. A certain proportion of people with Parkinson's disease who are being treated with L-DOPA for their Parkinson's disease will develop compulsive patterns of L-DOPA taking. They'll start to abuse their L-DOPA. They'll take it at much higher doses. They'll go get prescriptions from different physicians because so they can get more of their L-DOPA. And they show a variety of these kinds of compulsive addiction-like behaviors. Okay? So this is what this is. DDS is, and this is called dopamine dysregulation syndrome. By the way, soon as you take them off, it goes away. That is, if you take them off the L-DOPA. It's a problem, of course, because they're being treated for Parkinson's, so you got a real problem here. However, the main point here is this is looking at dopamine release again, and now they've inverted it, so up is more. These are Parkinson's, they're all Parkinson's. The controls are Parkinson's patients. And you get a certain amount of release, and this is ventral striatum, which is the accumbens. But in those Parkinson's patients that have developed this dopamine dysregulation syndrome and are abusing their medications, you get sensitized dopamine release. And that sensitized dopamine release is positively correlated to how much they want the drug. And we'll come back to this wanting kind of topic in a second. But it's correlated with how much they want the drug. Notice that it's not correlated with how much they say they like the L-DOPA, but the more the dopamine release goes up, the more they want, but they don't like it anymore. Okay, and we'll come back to this wanting-liking distinction in a second. So, just to summarize so far, repeated exposure to a variety of drugs of abuse can sensitize dopamine systems. Now, you should mention that many other drug effects are showing tolerance at the same time. You can see tolerance and sensitization at the same time to different drug effects. So amphetamine is a good example. Back in the 60s, amphetamine was the prototypical diet pill. It was described as your diet pill, right? Can't do that anymore because a lot of people got addicted to amphetamines. What happens if you take the drug repeatedly in terms of the appetite suppressant effects? They get smaller and smaller and smaller. So you take higher and higher doses to get better appetite suppressant, and that's when you really get into trouble. So the appetite suppressant effects are showing tolerance at the same time as the psychomotor effects are showing sensitization. Different drug effects change in different ways because they're mediated by different biological systems that change differently as a function of repeated exposure to the drugs. So you're not sensitizing to the drug, or you're not showing tolerance to the drug. It's a particular effect. Some effects undergo sensitization, other effects undergo tolerance. The psychomotor acting and rewarding effects seem to undergo this sensitization type of adaptation. So, repeated exposure to drugs sensitizes brain dopamine systems. So how does that contribute to addiction? And to address that issue, we have to step back and ask, so what does dopamine do? What role does dopamine have in reward? Well, we know, everyone agrees, dopamine is very important in some aspect of reward. That is, whether it's food reward or sex reward or water reward or drug reward, this dopamine system is very, very important in mediating some aspect of reward for all of these different kinds of rewards. And it makes sense, of course. No system in the brain evolved to mediate the effects of drugs. None of the systems in their brain are there to mediate the effects of drugs. These brain systems evolved for something else. Drugs just happen to be tapping into them. And this VTA accumbens system seems to have evolved to mediate the propensity to look for food when you've got food there before. That is, the rewarding effects of natural rewards. So, what does dopamine do in reward then, since everyone agrees that it plays a role in reward? Well, if you get your information from New York Times or any other public media or popular media, you'll know that dopamine is the brain's pleasure transmitter. You see it all the time in the popular media, that dopamine's the brain's pleasure transmitter. Now, so the role of dopamine in reward is to mediate pleasure. You take a drug, dopamine goes up, it gives you pleasure, you take the drug again, right? That's a pleasure-seeking. I mean, that fits perfectly into a pleasure-seeking kind of hypothesis of addiction if dopamine mediates pleasure. And where that idea came from, the idea that dopamine mediates pleasure, came from a specific paper published in Science in 1978 by Roy Wise. And in that paper, I'm not going to tell you what experiment they did, but his conclusion was neuroleptics, and neuroleptics are drugs that block dopamine. So what he was doing was giving a drug that blocks and prevents the action of dopamine. And what he found is if you block dopamine, you take the euphoria out of normally rewarding amphetamine and the goodness out of normal rewarding food. That is, his explanation as to why people and animals won't work for food or drugs when their dopamine system is blocked is because you've blocked the pleasure, right? This was the main view of the role of dopamine probably for 20, 25 years. Nobody believes it anymore. I mean, it's a good example of how scientists can basically reject a notion, but getting it out of the public, the popular media is really, really hard. This idea sort of sticks in the public imagination, in part because it's so nice and simple. Dopamine up, feel good up. But it's not true. I'm just going to give you a few examples of kinds of experiments that show that it's not true. First of all, if you get rid of dopamine, you don't have any effect on the ability of humans or rats to make normal judgments about taste stimuli. So you put tastes into the mouth, some are good, some are bad, and you can, people you can ask how good or bad is it, and if you do that in Parkinson's patients who have their dopamine mostly gone, they're absolutely normal, and so are rats. Rats tell you by orofacial reactions how good or bad it is. So there's no change in the ability to judge the hedonic properties of foods when you have no dopamine. So that's a problem. If dopamine mediates pleasure, that shouldn't happen. Another kind of finding that came out a number of years ago were people that were recording from dopamine cells and simply asking, when do dopamine cells become active in the brain? And it turns out they become active when a cue out there in the environment says, food's going to come in a little bit, but they don't fire when you put the food in your mouth. That is, they fire in anticipation of receiving food, not when you're chewing on the food. Now, of course, if dopamine going up is a consequence of the feeling good, the goodness of food, it should fire when the food's in your mouth. But that's not what happens. It fires to cues out there in the environment that predict it. Another kind of observation that was made, well, good things, yes, do cause dopamine cells to fire, but so do bad things, like foot shock in a rat. That is, all kinds of aversive stimuli also cause dopamine to go up. You don't usually think of those as pleasurable kinds of stimuli. So that's kind of hard for a hedonia view of dopamine. And another kind of study, this was done by Harriet DeWitt in Chicago, who brought people into the lab, gave them a dopamine antagonist, and then gave them amphetamine. Now, so what the amphetamine is doing is preventing the action of dopamine. And what she found was blocking dopamine had no effect on the ability of amphetamine to make you feel good. They still felt good under dopamine. What they reported, though, is that they didn't want it anymore. So they felt as good, but they didn't want it. And that takes us to this idea of what dopamine's doing in reward. So striatal dopamine's important for some aspect of reward, but it's not mediating the subjective pleasurable effects that you get when you consume rewards, be they foods or drugs. What is it doing? And this takes us to the notion of this dissociation between wanting and liking. And Kent Berridge, my colleague here at the University of Michigan, has become very famous for a whole series of studies where he showed, as far as the brain is concerned, how much you want things is totally dissociable to how much you like things. Now, of course, usually what you want, you should like what you want and want what you like, and normally they go together. But when you start to muck around with the brain, you start to see that, in fact, these are really separable psychological constructs, and they have very different neurobiological substrates. I'm not going to review all of the literature. Just suffice it to say, there's a lot of studies now that show these are different concepts. That is, wanting is not the same as liking. And this just sort of illustrates the idea in a block diagram. That is, that Kent developed this sort of model of what he called the incentive salience model of motivation that builds on models that were developed by other psychologists, Bindra and Totes earlier. But the main point I want to make here is that there's a lot of evidence now showing that there's one neural system, we call it the incentive salience system, that mediates how much you want things. And what's meant by that is how much you're motivated to work for them, how willing you are to work for them, and how attractive they become. Okay? So there's one psychological process and one neural system that mediates this, and this is what dopamine seems to do. It seems to mediate the strength of your desires. However, there's another whole system that mediates the hedonic consequences of receiving the award. And so that's what we're referring to as liking. This psychological system is not dependent on dopamine. It's dependent on completely different neurotransmitter systems that I'm not going to go into. So the basic idea here is this: how much you want things and how much you like things can be dissociated because in the brain they're handled differently. You don't see it. I mean, in your normal life, you want what you like and like what you want for the most part. Of course, it doesn't take too long thinking. You can start to think of all kinds of examples where that doesn't really hold, where you find yourself wanting things that you don't really like and liking things that you don't really want. But I'll leave that to your imagination. So what's the relevance of this wanting-liking distinction in addiction? So this led to a paper that Kent and I published a number of years ago that we called the incentive sensitization theory of paper. And it basically just takes 2 points that I've made to you already and puts them together. It actually is a relatively simple idea. That is, I had been studying the sensitization phenomena for a number of years. That is, dopamine systems is becoming hypersensitive with repeated exposure to drugs. And Kent found that, well, but dopamine mediates wanting, but not liking. And all you have to do is put that idea together with that, and you have incentive sensitization theory. That is, if the dopamine system is sensitizing and the dopamine system mediates wanting, then what should happen as the dopamine system sensitizes? You should want more and more and more. It's pretty straightforward. It took us 50 pages here to say that, but you can boil it down. And in fact, I'm going to take this, what's over a 50-page paper, and I'm going to boil down our concept of what's going on in addiction to 4 points. And they're the 4 main points in this incentive sensitization theory. The first point is potentially addictive drugs share the ability to produce long-lasting adaptations in neural systems. Basically, that means repeated exposure to drugs change the brain. Everybody agrees with that now. We know that drugs not only produce hypersensitivity in these dopamine systems, but you get all kinds of changes in all kinds of systems, and not only at a neurochemical level. If you go in and look at the structure of neurons, you actually, with repeated exposure to drugs, change the physical structure of neurons. That is, the brain of the addict is physically different than the brain of a non-addict. And there's no doubt about that. No one argues about this anymore. There's just a huge wealth of evidence on this. So this happens. The other point of incentive sensitization theory is that the brain systems are changed, include those that are normally involved in this process of incentive, motivation, and reward. So the brain is changed. Where in the brain is changed? Well, one place in the brain is changed is this VTA accumbens dopamine circuitry. That region is changed, and that region of the brain is thought to be involved in incentive, motivation, and reward. The third point is that the critical change, and there's many changes that take place with drugs, but for addiction, we think the critical change is this producing this hypersensitivity in these brain motivation circuits, if you will, that renders them hypersensitive. It's a sensitization kind of a change, not a blowing a hole in your brain kind of change. You're getting more, not less function from the brain systems. And lastly, the brain systems that are sensitized don't mediate the pleasure, the euphorogenic effects of drugs, that is how much they're liked, but instead they mediate a subcomponent of reward that Kent and I have called incentive salience. But you can think of that as this wanting process, this desire kind of process, this change in a system that mediates how hard you're willing to work to get it. So, again, so the basic idea here then is fairly simple. Drugs sensitize these dopamine systems, and what these dopamine systems do is mediate incentive motivation or wanting or desire for, and in this case, of course, for drug. But it's not like the drug's that much greater anymore after you've had exposure. And in fact, when you think about sort of the life history of an addict, we've known, again, for a long time, sort of by definition, and time here is months or years in the development of addiction, the incentive value of drugs, and again, all I mean by that is how hard you're willing to get it, how motivated how motivated you are to work for it, how much you want it. That property of drugs increases. By definition of addiction, addicts pathologically want drugs. As they become addicts, they want drugs more and more and more. But at the same time, the ability of drugs to produce pleasure is actually thought to show some tolerance. It actually goes down. And that's a kind of a weird thing when you think of it. How can it be in the addict out here that they want something so much when they actually like it less? It certainly doesn't make sense if you think that liking it is what produces how much you want it. And so this is an example of a dissociation between this wanting and liking. And again, you shouldn't see this kind of dissociation. They should match one another. But where you see these kinds of dissociations is when you muck up the brain. And that's what you're doing in addiction. You're mucking up the brain. You're changing it. And so you're seeing these different psychological processes fracturing apart in ways that are hard to see in a normal individual. And the fracturing that's taking place, we think, is that this system, this wanting system, it's becoming sensitized. And so you have pathological motivation for drugs, whereas this liking system is not really changing or is even showing some tolerance. And so the concept of incentive sensitization is fairly simple. The sensitization of these brain motivation systems leads to pathological wanting, and over time, the wanting becomes dissociated from liking, and you end up with this weird creature that you call the addict. I like to use this quote, and I'm just about done here, because this sort of idea has been around for a long time. This is William James, famous American psychologist and philosopher, 1890. Now, he's talking about alcohol because it's a drunken Rip Van Winkle, but for our purposes, let's just generalize to all drugs. And he says, well, we're spinning our own fates for good or evil. The drunken Rip Van Winkle excuses himself for every first dereliction by saying, I won't count this time. Well, he might not count it, and the kind heaven might not count it, but it's being counted nonetheless. Down among his nerve cells and fibers, the molecules are counting it, registering and storing it up to be used against him when the next temptation arises. And this is basically incentive sensitization. That is, you take the drug repeatedly, and down in that dopamine system, it's being counted, because each time you take it, it's being registered and stored up by these kinds of changes in these brain circuits. And it's going to be used against you when the next time temptation comes, because when the next temptation presents itself, you're going to get a bigger surge of dopamine, which is going to lead to a much more stronger desire for the drug and the kind of problems that you see in addiction. So William James basically had the basics of it back in 1860. So Kent and I, what we argue is that, at its heart, addiction is a very complicated process, let me say first. And withdrawal avoidance plays a role. Pleasure seeking plays a role. These things are all happening and they're all real. What we're trying to ask here, what are necessary and sufficient conditions? Where are the real causal conditions that lead to these compulsive patterns of drug seeking and drug taking behavior? It doesn't mean all of these other processes aren't important, but we argue that at its heart, addiction is really a disorder of this aberrant incentive motivation, this wanting or desire to drugs. And the reason you see this pathological desire for drugs is because drugs have changed the brain. They've sensitized these neural systems that evolved to mediate the motivational effects of natural rewards, which is important to get them for survival. Now, I've focused all the talk on this top part, that is the idea that drugs become wanted more and more by the process of incentive sensitization, and I'm arguing that's the core. But I've left out a whole other story, so you should just know that I've only given you a little piece of the story. And that has to do with also what's happening in other brain regions besides these motivational dopamine systems. Another thing that's happening that we know very, very well is that the prefrontal cortex of the brain is becoming impaired. You get marked impairment in prefrontal cortical systems. What do prefrontal cortical systems do? Prefrontal cortical systems are thought to be these top-down executive control systems that are very much involved in sort of looking forward in terms of making judgments and inhibitory control over behavior. It's a system that sort of allows us to resist our basest desires, if you will. And that system is being damaged by drugs. There's absolutely no doubt about that. I think everybody agrees with that as well. And so what you have in addiction is a sensitization of how much you want the drug, but at the same time, your ability to make reasoned judgments about the future consequences of taking drugs and to exert inhibitory control over these drug-seeking actions and controlled decisions is becoming impaired. And so again, in addiction, you're getting a double whammy. The drugs are changing these motivational systems, making you want the drug more and more and more, and they're impairing systems that allow you to make reasoned judgments. You make stupid decisions. And of course, if you make pathological wanting and you combine it with really stupid decisions, you have, I think, what is basically the addict who gets trapped into this taking drugs. And so it's not just wanting more, but it's also failure of being able to inhibit those kinds of actions. And so that combination is particularly disadvantageous. And so that's how we get addicted. And I just wanted to acknowledge again, Kent, again, all of this development of a sensitization theory kinds of stuff was all done in collaboration with Kent Berridge, who's the James Old Collegiate Professor of Psychology and Neuroscience in Psychology here at the University of Michigan. And thank you for your attention. And I'm happy to take.
And if anyone has a question, just raise their hand and I'll come around.
You have to wait for him with the mic.
Yes, right here.
There's one. Oh, okay, back.
Hi, I wanted to know if this sensitization produces changes genetically, which then can be passed down, so that if you have a parent that was an addict, then you would be more susceptible to it. In my training back a million years ago, that's what I learned.
Yeah. So no one's actually done this study. So there's a whole new field that has developed called epigenetics. So it used to be, of course, you had your genes and these were passed down and they didn't change. But the field of epigenetics, which is developing very, very rapidly, is showing that's not the case all the time. That is, epigenetics referred to, because most of the genes in any one of your cells is turned off at any one point in time, and they can turn on or off. Epigenetics is sort of referring to the phenomena or the discovery.
Oh, I just want to remind you not to travel too far from the mic, I'm sorry.
The phenomena or the discovery that indeed changes in gene expression in parents can be passed down to offspring, and so that they then also express the gene that the parents did. So we know that kind of phenomena that you're talking about is certainly possible. In terms of these sensitization effects, no one, there's a couple studies out there, but no one has definitively shown that those changes are passed on to other generations through epigenetic kinds of mechanisms. But it's certainly a possible kind of thing. Someone has to do the experiments.
Okay, we had one up here.
I'm hoping I can put this right. Some people become addicted more readily than others. Now, I'm wondering what the if it is known what the preconditions on the physiological level are. I'm just going to give an example. Like some people have problems with their energy level and focusing on things, and amphetamines might make them function better temporarily. Do they understand what is going on in these people's physiologically that makes them more susceptible than others?
Sure.
Am I getting
Yeah,
this right?
sure, yeah. What you're asking about is sort of susceptibility or resilience to develop addiction. And again, this is an enormous field. There's tons of studies, both in humans and animals, trying to understand. Well, I know it's feeding back with that mic probably. Anyways, there's a huge number of studies asking about individual variation in susceptibility or resilience to addiction. And yes, there's huge individual variation. We know that. And people talk about things like impulsivity, for example, or sensation-seeking kind of personality traits. So there's a number of personality traits that seem to predispose. When you look at sort of the environmental effects, so I'll class all that into environmental effects versus genetic effects, for almost all of these kinds of things, it's about 50-50. That is, the variation is about 50% genetic, 50% environmental. That's true for almost any complex psychological trait. It always breaks down around 50-50. And so what's been identified are a number of characteristics that will predispose one way or the other. And again, so there's a whole field of that. You can see that not only in humans, you see it, there's lots of animal models where you see this enormous individual variation. In terms of the sensitization phenomena, there's also enormous individual variation, and that's something I didn't talk about at all. But some animals, when you give them the drugs repeatedly, sensitize like crazy. Other animals don't sensitize at all. And our strong argument would be, of course, those that sensitize a lot are the ones that are going to be more prone to develop addiction-like problems. We know some of the factors that confer susceptibility to sensitization, but we don't know much how they actually work. So we know genetic factors are very important. Some strains, inbred strains of mice don't sensitize, and some sensitize like crazy. So genetic factors are clearly important. But we know environmental factors are important as well. The environment in which you get the drug, experience the drug, determines how quickly your brain changes. If you get the drug at home, your brain changes relatively slowly. If you get the drug out in the club, brain changes much faster. That's a club for a rat, mind you. So these kind of environmental factors we know are very, very important. There's huge sex differences. We know that there's big sex differences in sensitization, which is mediated by the influence of gonadal hormones, which modulate dopamine. And so, yes, that's an enormous area of research. The bottom line is no one really understands how any of it works. That is, we know the variation, we know some of the risk factors, but how that leads to more or less addiction is really not well understood.
Okay, we have another question here.
Yeah, if I can, I've got 2 or 3, but quick answers would be fine. Mm-hmm. I noticed cannabis was not on those lists. Could you speak a moment on cannabis? in relation to the
Yeah.
sensitization dopamine.
On the original list of drugs that increase dopamine, THC was there.
Oh,
So
okay.
typically in animal studies, you don't give them cannabis because they don't like smoking joints very much.
Okay,
But you
so
give them delta-9
it wasn't-
THC, and you can see dopamine effects. And there are some reports of some sensitization. Now, relative to some of these other drugs, it's a very, very weak effect.
Okay. Cross-sensitization, and has there been new thought about cross-tolerance?
Well, there's both cross-tolerance and cross-sensitization.
Right.
I'll refer to cross-sensitization again. So there's lots of studies on cross-sensitization. And that refers to the fact that if you've been exposed to, say, cocaine in the past, you'll later on in life be also sensitized to amphetamine. You'll be sensitized to heroin, opiates, morphine, and so on. So that's cross-sensitization. Exposure to one drug can make you hypersensitive to the others. That's sometimes asymmetrical because if you've had heroin in the past, or at least morphine in the past, you actually don't become sensitized to stimulants. So stimulants cross-sensitize to opiates, but opiates not to stimulants. The other big kind of effect that shows cross-sensitization is to stress. So animals that have had drugs in the past and are sensitized to them are hypersensitive to stressors. And individuals that have had exposure to stress in the past are hypersensitive to drugs. They're sensitized to drugs. And so you see this cross-sensitization effect between drugs and stressors. And of course, stress also is one of these factors that plays in a role in terms of determining susceptibility or resilience to develop addiction.
Finally, dopamine it doesn't have the pleasure connection effect there, but it does have the alertness and the hyper and so forth, which in a sense is, something a person is seeking. Was the research done to tease apart that incentive from just the wanting part?
Well,
Does that
most
make
of the studies on psychomotor sensitization are sort of looking at that. That is, you're giving the drug and animals are becoming very active. And one interpretation of why animals are running around their room that you have them in is in fact that, oh, that over there looks really cool. Oh, that looks really cool over there. Oh, that's really good. That is, everything is lighting up in terms of its motivational properties. And that's what's causing the animals to become very, very hyperactive. And that process sensitizes. So the psychomotor sensitization is not the same as sensitization or drug reward or incentive sensitization. They're related because they relied on somewhat common neural mechanisms, but they're not exactly the same thing. But this sort of, I use the phrase, becoming wired kind of an effect that you get with amphetamine or cocaine, that clearly sensitizes. And you see that in humans. I mean, many examples of that in humans. In humans, this is called punding, where you show these repetitive behaviors with high doses of amphetamine, for example. And what you see is sensitization of that behavior in people. That's studied back in the 60s and 70s. So you see this psychomotor sensitization in people as well as in animals.
Okay, thanks.
Anyone else? Okay, back up here.
So what about the treatment?
What about treatment? Well, the implications of for at least incentive sensitization theory is that what you want to do is reverse these drug-induced, sensitization type neuroadaptations in the brain. And no one's come up with a way quite to do that. And it could be very difficult to do because, don't forget, many things change that system, and so it may be difficult to get it to go back, quote, to normal. I'll give you my standard take on treatment approaches. The National Institute of Drug Abuse puts an enormous amount of money into developing pharmacotherapeutic approaches, a pill that you can take that so makes you not an addict. And I'm a real skeptic when it comes to psychotherapeutic approaches. That is, the probability, again, of a pill that all of a sudden makes you not an addict, that produces any kind of persistent effect, I find unlikely. So I'm more of a proponent, and it's not inconsistent with incentive sensitization theory, for psychotherapeutic approaches. What are you doing with psychotherapeutic kinds of approaches? What you're trying to do is change the brain as a consequence of experience. Your brain changes. I mean, these changes in brain are the same kinds of changes in brain that take place when you learn something. Your brain is changing all the time. It's made to change. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to learn. And so one kind of psychotherapeutic approach that's becoming fairly popular is, yes, your brain is, this dopamine system is sensitized, but perhaps we can develop techniques that allow this sort of executive control system sort of to tamp down these urges, if you will, and that you develop effective psychotherapeutic approaches to deal with the urges. And that's what a lot of treatment is about, learning how to deal with the urges that are there. Getting rid of the urges themselves is, no one's been able to do that very successfully in addiction. They tend to come back after a period of time. Yeah, you go into treatment, you stop taking it, but you come out and you're back again. And so you really need to be able to control those kinds of things. And I think your psychotherapeutic approaches are going to do that. And what you're doing, again, is changing the systems through these kinds of psychological approaches, so you don't just go with the urge and go with the desire. Now, one problem with that, of course, is the drugs have also compromised the prefrontal cortical system, which is needed to do that. And so, so it's a matter of really trying to develop procedures that will get around that and will be effective. And again, there's a large literature of people trying to develop exactly those kinds of things. I'm not a big fan of a magic pill, though.
In regards to irreversibility of the sensitization that's seen with some drugs or what people think might be irreversible, is there any correlation of that with physical changes to the neuron in the brain? And if someone seizes their addiction and no longer uses drugs, do the neurons change back to what they previously were?
Yeah, but no one's really come up with a way to reverse it, though. So, I mean, there are examples of people using drugs where sensitization isn't expressed now. But part of the problem there is you don't know that the change in brain isn't still there, and all you did was produce another, those drugs are sort of blocking it at some point. Or did you really reverse the critical changes in brain that mediate sensitization? The problem there is we actually don't know what the critical changes in brain are that mediate sensitization per se. As I said, when you give drugs, any of these drugs repeatedly, everything changes. You got changes in dopamine systems, serotonin systems, acetylcholine systems. The physical cells themselves change. They grow dendrites. They get bigger. They get more synaptic contacts. What's happening with these sensitization kind of protocols is you're literally changing the wiring diagram. So the wiring diagram's different. But what we don't know is which change in the wiring diagram is a necessary and sufficient change to account for these sensitization phenomena. We know there's tons of changes, but we don't know which ones are causal. And so before you can ask, how can we reverse the critical change, we actually need to know what the hell the critical change is. And we really don't. We know that there's lots of changes. We have suspects, but that's, again, where a lot of research is ongoing, is try to understand the critical change. And that's really a fundamental question in brain-behavior relations. Which cells in which circuits control which functions. And we don't know much about that. We sort of know at a certain level, yeah, dopamine's important for reward and it seems to be involved in wanting. How? At a real mechanistic level. So never mind about these complex psychological processes, just think about vision. We don't know how we see things. We don't know how we can perceive touch, again, at any kind of deep level. And so it's not surprising we don't understand how the brain mediates these more complex psychological functions.
Okay, here's another question here.
Is work being done to find that out?
Oh yeah, there's a lot of research going on to determine exactly that, answer exactly those kinds of questions.
I have another question. Do you have to have that combination, to be considered an addiction, does there have to be that combination of an increase in wanting and a decrease in liking?
I don't think it's a sort of a necessary situation, but it just sort of seems to be how it is.
It's obviously a very unstable situation, and do you know what's keeping it from just getting worse and worse and worse?
Well, there's probably, in terms of the sensitization phenomena, there's probably sort of an asymptote. That is, there's a limit in terms of the extent to which the system can change, at which point more drug really doesn't produce any more change. But again, We don't understand very well what that asymptote is, and it's going to depend on what your measure is, and is it a behavioral measure, which can be problematic for that kind of question? Is it a neurobiological measure? What's the critical neurobiological measure? But there's probably a limit to the plasticity that doesn't result in your head exploding.
Could I ask another one? I don't know if it's done anymore, but 20 or 30 years ago, for addicts, treatment involved trying substitute drugs. I'm sorry, I don't remember everything the way I used to. I don't remember the name of it, but it was almost universally when someone was a heroin addict, treatment was to put them on a different drug.
Yeah, the drug you're thinking of is methadone.
You're right, I am. Yes.
Yeah.
That didn't seem to work from my observation.
Yeah, and that's still actually fairly widely used today, much more so in other countries than in the U.S. The U.S. is always a little problematic when it comes to giving addicts drugs. But methadone clinics are fairly common. And the idea with methadone, what you're doing, methadone, by the way, if you give it to addicts and they have a syringe and they can take it intravenously, it's like heroin. I mean, it's totally addictive. The reason it sort of works as a substitute, it really has to do with how quickly the drug gets to the brain. For drugs to produce euphorogenic effects, they have to get to the brain fast. That's why addicts are going to smoke it or inject it, because it gets the drug to the brain fast. Methadone you're taking orally, and so the methadone drug gets to the brain very slowly, and you want to maintain a constant level. If you do that, you'll prevent withdrawal, but you won't have these euphorogenic effects. And so all you've done is taken. You can do the same thing, by the way, with heroin, if you did the same thing and change its kinetics. And so that all has to do with the kinetics. And so the people are coming in, they're taking their methadone, they're not getting, quote, high, but they're also avoiding withdrawal, and they'll go on, they can stay on methadone for a long period of time. There is no such drug for things like amphetamines or cocaine, although again, NIDA is spending a lot of money to try to find substitutes. But of course, you're not, in a sense, the person's still an addict. It's just they're an addict under control now. The classic cases of addicts under control are physicians. There's a high incidence of addiction in physicians. And then there's many examples historically, particularly of very, very famous, successful physicians who, 20, 30 years were addicts either to cocaine or heroin. There's a guy in our, who's the guy in the medical school who wrote the book on Freud, and there's a University of Michigan professor who wrote a very famous book about exactly these kinds of cases. But the thing there is, what they have is ready access to the drugs at a stable level. Where the real problem comes is that you take away that access and then things go to hell.
Okay, another question here.
I'd like please to hear about the liking system. Like if that system would be stronger, would that dissociation be overcome?
In what situation?
That liking system, as you told about dissociation, the wanting and liking system. So I wanted to hear more about the liking system.
The liking, in terms of drug effects, to the best of our knowledge, the liking effects of drugs, that is, the amount of pleasure that they produce, either doesn't change sort of over your career as an addict or shows tolerance. All the textbooks say that the phorogenic effects show tolerance. If you go to the literature and actually find studies that show that, it's next to impossible to find studies that show that. But everyone says it in the textbooks. It's just the data's not really there. And one reason is, if you think of it, how would you do that experiment? You'd have to take some drug-naive people and give them the drug the first time, and then turn them into addicts, and over time, measure how much euphorogenic effects they get. And you can't do that experiment. So what you have is asking people, when you started taking drugs 25 years ago, how good was it relative to what it is now? That's not science. People's memories are very, very faulty when it comes to those kinds of things. And so the textbooks will all tell you you get tolerance to the phorogenic effects of drugs, but the actual evidence is really, really skimpy. And it relies on these retrospective, how do you remember it being 20 years ago?
Anyone else? And over on the other side of the room here, hang on. Keep going from one side of the room to the other.
So this is more of a political question, but
I don't do those.
when you first published your paper with Dr. Berridge, did you face a lot of controversy within the field of neuroscience? And then how have you responded to researchers that have been skeptical or maybe resisted that this theory was even valid at all?
That's not a political question. That's just everyday science. When we published it, we faced a huge amount of criticism. It was great. I'd go and give a talk on this sort of stuff and at a scientific meeting, and people would be lined up at the mic to attack me. I always thought that was great. That's what makes it exciting. So yes, there's been a lot of resistance over the years. Although in science, what happens is, what lasts? You can say what lasts. And it turns out that original incentive sensitization theory paper is the most cited paper in addiction these days. So we're quite happy with its outcome, and people still cite it as much today as they did 10, 15 years ago. So it's sort of stuck. And that's how you tell whether you might have a good idea. It sticks. If it doesn't stick, it just disappears. And lots of stuff disappears. But it's okay. It's okay. Scientists love to fight. That's you fight with one or all, and you shouldn't resist that. That's a good thing. It's when people don't ask you any questions that's the problem.
And I think we're just about out of time. Is there anything you'd like to say in conclusion?
I talked out. Thank you.